Hey guys, tonight we ease ourselves into a place where the sun blazes mercilessly, the wind picks up dust and scatters it like a baker shaking flour across a board. And yet, against all common sense, you're about to stumble upon ice. Not a lukewarm puddle, not a faint chill, but actual frozen water, carefully kept safe in the middle of Persia's desert heat. You probably won't survive this walk without sunscreen, water, and a strong hat. But don't worry, this is bedtime history, so you get to stay cozy in your bed instead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you've got a spare moment, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a dusty road where sand presses into your sandals and the horizon wavers like it's made of liquid metal. The desert is hot enough to make you feel like your eyelids weigh a pound each. Yet as you squint, you notice something odd rising against the skyline. A dome, almost like a giant beehive, pale against the sun. At first glance you think it's just another storage building, but as you come closer, villagers smile knowingly. You're standing before a yak khal, literally an ice pit, an ancient Persian refrigerator built centuries before your kitchen freezer would hum to life. The structure is larger than you imagined, 40, maybe 50 feet tall, tapering gracefully to a rounded tip, its mud brick walls sun-baked into a hard shell. The air around it feels strangely cooler, as though the dome itself sighs out a whisper of winter. You run your hand across its surface. It's rough, gritty, but cool compared to the baking ground under your feet. That's because its walls are made from a special mortar called sarouj, a mix of clay, sand, lime, ash, goat hair, and rumour has it, a pinch of camel's blood. Historians still argue whether the blood ingredient is fact or just a poetic exaggeration, but the mixture undeniably resists water and heat like an ancient desert superhero cape. A local guide gestures for you to step closer. He lowers his voice, as if revealing a secret everyone already knows. These domes were not barns or temples, but ingenious vaults designed to capture cold air during the fleeting winter months. Inside, a labyrinth of subterranean chambers slope downward, keeping ice packed beneath thick insulation. Even at the height of summer, when scorpions scuttle for shade and water skins grow warm within minutes, these structures hold pockets of frozen luxury. It's strangely comforting to know that people living 1,000 years ago wrestled with the same question you might ask during a July heatwave. How do I keep my drink cold? Only for them it was also, how do I keep my medicine cool, my fruit fresh, and my royal guests impressed? You take a deep breath, the desert wind carrying the faint scent of baked clay. Your mind drifts to the effort it must have taken to build something so massive. Villagers stacking mud bricks by hand, children fetching water, architects squinting at the sun's path to orient the dome just right. Remember, this isn't just one dome. At the peak of Persian ingenuity, entire cities were dotted with these silent guardians of ice, standing against the odds of climate. And here you are, leaning against one like a weary traveller in need of shade. The wall radiates coolness as if it remembers the snow it once swallowed months ago. You smile, imagining what it must have felt like for a child in the 10th century to slip inside, touch real ice, and press it against a sunburned cheek. A miracle, wrapped in mud and mathematics. But the miracle didn't rely only on architecture. It depended on careful timing. In winter, when mountain passes opened and rivers slowed, villagers harvested snow and ice, dragging it down on donkeys, piling it in trenches near the yakchal. They packed it tight, covered it with straw, then guided it into the underground chamber. The dome above acted like a lid, channeling heat away, letting cool air settle in. A blend of simple physics and communal determination. As you linger, you notice that life around the dome seems to revolve in gentle circles. Families walk past, pointing toward the structure with a casual pride. An old man taps his cane against the ground, telling a story you can't quite hear, but you guess it's about a time when the dome saved the town during a brutal drought. A group of children giggle, daring each other to put their faces against the cool surface, pulling away with exaggerated gasps as if they've touched a piece of the moon. The sun lowers a little, softening the shadows. You picture yourself stepping inside, down a sloping ramp into the cavernous belly. Darkness would fold over you, thick and cool, and the air would smell faintly of earth and straw. Your fingers might brush against chunks of ice, stacked neatly like forgotten treasure. You'd want to carve your initials into one, but resist, because even in the 6th century someone would probably scold you for wasting precious cold. Here's the quirky part. These domes weren't only about function. They became symbols of ingenuity, resilience, and yes, even bragging rights. If your town had a yak carl, you weren't just surviving, you were living with a touch of icy luxury. There's an old Persian poem that praises the taste of sherbet cooled by mountain ice, as if a drink itself could whisper to the stars. Standing outside the dome, you feel the weight of centuries pressing gently against your shoulders. This isn't just a mud brick structure. It's proof that humans, even in harsh climates, find ways to bend the world toward comfort. And tonight, as you let your eyelids grow heavy, you realize the coolest thing about ice in the desert isn't the ice itself. It's the stubborn imagination that kept it alive, frozen, and waiting to refresh someone just like you. You shuffle along a winding trail, the desert crunching beneath your sandals, and soon the air changes. Instead of the heavy stillness you've grown used to, you catch a sharp, crisp scent, mountain air carried down from the snowy ridges looming faintly in the distance. That's where the next part of the story unfolds. Winter in Persia was no small event. For all its blistering summers, the land could turn bitterly cold in the highlands. Snow piled thick across peaks and streams froze into glittering veins. You imagine villagers looking up at those mountains the way you might eye a well-stocked refrigerator when you're thirsty. There's the treasure, but first you have to reach it. Harvesting winter snow wasn't a casual stroll with a sled. It was an orchestrated effort. You see lines of men and donkeys trudging up icy paths, breath steaming, hands raw from the cold. Their goal was simple but back-breaking. Collect enough snow and ice to last until the long summer burned everything dry. They shoveled snow into woven baskets, packing it down so tightly it squeaked. Some accounts describe trenches lined with straw where the snow was pressed into slabs, almost like bricks of frozen milk. You picture yourself lugging one of those bricks downhill, and honestly, you'd probably give up halfway and just sit on it until someone scolded you. Mainstream historians agree that Persia's cities, particularly during the Achaemenid and later the Safavid dynasties, depended heavily on these winter harvests. Without them, the Yakchal would be little more than an empty dome with a draft. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some villages organized festive days for the snow harvest. Families followed the workers up the slopes, turning the labor into something closer to a holiday. Children threw snowballs, goats wandered dangerously near the piles, and elders claimed the first scoop of clean snow tasted like honey if you let it melt on your tongue. Historians still argue whether these festivals were official events or simply folklore that grew with retelling, but either way, it's a comforting thought. That hard work in the biting cold came with laughter and warm fires waiting at the end. Now, picture the journey back down. Caravans of donkeys and camels plodded carefully, burdened with dripping loads. Each block of snow was wrapped in straw or reed mats to slow the inevitable melting. Imagine the frustration. You've just heaved an enormous basket of snow onto your poor donkey, and halfway home you realize half of it has already turned to slush. You can almost hear someone muttering, "Great, now, the Yakchal is going to be half full, and my wife is going to remind me for years about the time I let her sherbet melt." The roads themselves became part of the challenge. In winter, some paths were treacherous with ice. In spring, swollen streams cut across the way. Villagers had to time their harvest perfectly, not too early, when snow might still be loose and powdery, and not too late, when the thaw threatened to ruin everything. You trudge behind the line of animals, each step sinking into soft snow, and wonder if the rhythm of hoofbeats and bells gave the journey its own kind of lullaby. What makes this all the more fascinating is the sheer volume involved. A single yakshal could hold tons of ice, enough for entire communities. That meant dozens of trips, season after season, a rhythm as dependable as planting and harvest. Ice wasn't just a luxury for kings, it became part of everyday life, at least in towns lucky enough to have the infrastructure. You imagine housewives waiting eagerly for the first shipments, ready to store melons and pomegranates against the summer heat. Children surely dreamed of sneaking small chips of ice, even if their parents swatted their hands away with mock sternness. And yet, behind the cosy picture, there's always a debate. Did every Persian town truly rely on mountain ice, or were some more dependent on shaded pools and clever use of underground canals, known as kanats? Historians still argue about just how widespread the practice of long-distance snow-hauling was, since written records can be sparse. But the archaeological evidence of straw-lined trenches and partially collapsed ice pits suggests that at least in some regions the labour of snow-hauling was as common as sowing barley or pressing olives. As you walk with the caravan in your mind's eye, the desert horizon stretches ahead. The contrast is almost laughable. On one side, a blistering expanse where even lizards squint unhappily. On the other, a creaking donkey carrying bundles of snow like a mobile freezer. You can't help but smile at the image, Persian ingenuity walking literally step by step across a landscape that should have made such luxury impossible. When the caravan finally reaches the village, the excitement is palpable. People gather at the yakchal to watch the unloading. Blocks of snow are slid carefully into the underground chambers, straw cushioning each layer. Children hover near the entrance, their faces glowing red from the cold air wafting up. One cheeky boy tries to sneak a handful, only to have his fingers smacked by his grandmother's cane. You lean against the mud-brick dome again, realizing you're witnessing the first stage of a months-long plan. The ice harvested today won't be eaten tonight. Instead, it will slumber in the cool dark, waiting for the fiery days ahead when its relief will feel nothing short of miraculous. You step closer to the dome, letting your eyes wander up its curved silhouette and begin to wonder what secrets lie hidden in the walls themselves. It's not just a random heap of mud and straw thrown together by weary hands. No, the Persians were master builders, and what you're staring at is the result of careful calculation, stubborn trial and error, and maybe even a little bit of architectural stubbornness. The yakhal wasn't simply a container for ice. It was a machine for survival, disguised as an oversized beehive. From the outside, its cone-shaped structure looks simple, but as you trail your hand along the wall, you feel the slope grow steeper, curving inward like a frozen wave. That shape wasn't for decoration. The conical design minimized direct sunlight exposure during the hottest hours, and it funneled hot air upward, away from the cool depths below. The Persians may not have had thermometers or climate models, but they understood the basics of airflow and insulation. The wider base and narrow tip acted like a chimney, quietly tugging the heat upward while keeping the belly of the dome dark and cold. Step through the small doorway, and you find yourself descending a gentle ramp. The air shifts, cooler, heavier, a little damp. You run your fingers along the inner wall, and it's smoother than the exterior, almost polished from centuries of contact. The walls are nearly 2 meters thick, built of saruj mortar. Mainstream historians point to this material as the true genius of the structure. It was waterproof, heat-resistant, and strong enough to endure earthquakes. Without it, your precious ice would have seeped into the soil in a matter of days. Here comes the quirky detail. Some old recipes for saruj included not just the clay, lime, and ash mixture, but animal hair, usually goat or camel, to bind the plaster. Villagers joked that every yakchal was half architecture, half livestock. Imagine brushing your hand along the wall and wondering, is this surface smooth thanks to the goat from last spring? It's a strangely comforting thought, knowing that even in monumental engineering, everyday animals left their mark. Historians still argue whether camel's blood was really part of the recipe or just a dramatic flourish added by later storytellers. After all, nothing makes a wall sound tougher than saying it's got literal blood in its veins. As you explore, the floor beneath your feet tilts gently downward. Yakshuls often included underground pits several meters deep, far below the reach of the desert sun. That depth was the first line of defense against heat. The second was airflow. Small vents carved at precise angles allowed cooler night air to flow inside, pushing warm air up and out. You picture yourself lying here on a sweltering August day, sighing in relief as the night wind sweeps gently through the vents. It's the closest thing the 5th century had to air conditioning, minus the electric bill. Another overlooked feature lies outside, the long, tall walls built alongside the dome. These weren't city defences or privacy barriers. They were shade walls, strategically placed to block sunlight and create shallow pools of water that froze overnight in winter. The villagers then scooped that ice and stored it inside the yakhal. You imagine crouching by one of those pools at dawn, the water crusted over with a delicate sheet of ice. Break it with your hand, and you've just created the first batch of summer survival fuel. Now think about maintenance. These domes weren't one and done. The walls had to be repaired each season, cracks filled, straw replaced. It's easy to picture a group of villagers climbing scaffolding with buckets of mortar, chatting casually as they patched the ancient fridge. What are you doing today? Oh, just repairing our desert ice machine. Same as always. And here's where the scholarly debate sneaks in. Historians still argue whether all yakhals were used exclusively for ice storage, or if some doubled as grain silos, water reservoirs, or even community gathering spots. The design seems perfect for more than one purpose, after all. Walk down into the shadowy belly of the dome, and you can imagine anything from sacks of barley stacked high to cool jugs of pomegranate juice waiting for a feast. The deeper you step into this space in your imagination, the quieter it becomes. The thick walls muffle sound, turning even your own breath into something hushed. You touch the wall again, chilled slightly from the earth's embrace, and you realize you're in a place where physics and culture met in harmony. The villagers may not have known the modern terms, thermal mass, evaporative cooling, convection, but they lived them, one ice block at a time. As you climb back up the ramp into the desert sunlight, you glance once more at the towering dome. It stands not just as a storage chamber, but as a statement. Here, in the harshest landscapes, humans still found a way to bend the environment. And all of this, every brick, every angled vent, every whisper of straw in the mortar, was part of a design so clever it feels like a secret only the desert could have taught. You settle your palm on the dome's coarse skin again, and this time, instead of marveling at thickness or slope, you pay attention to dampness. A hairline patch of moisture darkens the clay, and the air right above it feels a whisper cooler, like the breath of a sleeping cat. You have stumbled onto the quiet magic behind these structures. Evaporation, the art of losing water to gain comfort. It's the kind of deal the desert occasionally approves of, provided you pay in droplets. You slide along the wall to a shaded corner where the clay looks almost velvety. If you wet this surface at dusk, the night wind will sip the moisture and, in return, give you cooler air. You've used the same trick without noticing. Step out of a pool on a breezy day, and the air leans in and steals warmth from your skin. The yakhal just scales that sensation up, turning a trickle of moisture into a room-sized sigh. You can picture a caretaker sprinkling the outer wall with a pail, humming, tapping the mud with a palm to check absorption, and maybe grumbling that the goats have been drinking from the water trough again. Inside the dome, evaporation joins forces with thickness. The saruj wall drinks water slowly, then releases it to the air like a measured exhale. As that water evaporates, it lifts heat away from the wall, which lowers the interior temperature another notch. In summer, the effect helps the ice last longer. In winter, it helps the fresh frozen pools outside form and survive until sunrise. You start to understand why these builders loved conical shapes. Warm air travels upward, leaving cooler air to settle into the pit like a shy guest who prefers the darkest seat. Mainstream history students meet this concept in another Persian invention, the bajir, or wind catcher. Imagine a tall tower with open mouths facing the prevailing breeze, connected to rooms that need cooling. As wind slips in, it's guided over damp surfaces, through channels splashed with water from qanats, those underground canals that carry cool, shaded flow across long distances. The result is simple and elegant. Rooms cooled by air that has been gently wrung of heat, no plug required. The yakshal borrows this principle, vents set just so, a surface that tolerates dampness and a quiet collaboration between night wind and thirsty clay. Your modern fan might feel slightly threatened by the competition. You crouch near a vent and listen. There's the desert's low murmur, a soft whistle, the faintest drip somewhere deep. Evaporative cooling works best in dry air, and the Iranian plateau is generous in that regard. The less humidity in the breeze, the more it wants to drink. The dome's position, away from marshy ground, aligned to catch the evening breath, makes sense now. Someone, generations ago, watched shadows move across the land and learned where air behaved kindly. You follow their gaze, noting the shade wall, the orientation, the way the surface color is a dusty pale that reflects the sun rather than sulking beneath it. Here's your quirky tidbit to tuck under your pillow. Some households used miniature versions of this system for milk and fruit. A porous clay jar and zir-e-abi or similar water cooler vessel sat in a shallow pan. Water seeped through the jar, evaporated from its surface and cooled the milk inside. If you've ever hugged a clay water jug in a hot kitchen and noticed it felt cooler than the room, you've met the same physics. One can imagine a parent warning a child, "Don't drink straight from the jug. It's for everyone," while the child nods solemnly and immediately drinks straight from the jug. You know who you are. To test the concept the bedtime way, you picture dipping the edge of your sleeve in water and lifting it to the vent. The breeze licks it dry and your skin registers a soft chill. It's the desert's closest thing to a free sample. To keep the joke honest, no, we're not building a full-scale wind tunnel in your bedroom tonight, but your sleepy brain can still feel that gentle theft of heat, the kind that coaxes shoulders to drop and forehead lines to smooth out. Historians still argue whether every yakul relied primarily on evaporation, or whether some were essentially giant thermos flasks, counting more on thermal mass and shading than on deliberate wetting. The evidence changes with region and era. Not all domes were identical twins. In some places, groundwater from qanats was run along shallow channels beside the walls, supercharging the evaporative effect. In others, caretakers focused on protecting the ice with straw and minimizing door openings, trusting the earth's embrace and thick walls to do the heavy lifting. You can feel how each town negotiated its own treaty with climate, bargaining for another degree of cool. You step back outside where the shade wall casts a long, forgiving rectangle onto the ground. In winter, shallow basins here would be filled at dusk, the night's dry breath skimming across them, tugging away warmth until a thin crust formed. At dawn, villagers glided knives under the glaze, slid the sheets aside, stacked them with straw between layers, and marched them into the dome. The process sounds delicate, almost ceremonial. Picture a line of neighbors moving ice like folded linens, murmuring to keep concentration, the way you hush yourself when carrying a too-full mug of tea across a carpet. And because desert life makes space for humor, you suspect someone always slipped on a slick patch, arms pinwheeling, pride bruised more than knees. 2 small jokes later, the group pretended nothing happened, much the same way you pretend you meant to open the fridge 6 times in 10 minutes. The desert accepts humility as a cooling agent. Clever placement helped too. Builders cited yakchuls where nighttime temperatures dipped reliably. A few domes sat near the mouths of qanats, where the air lingering over cool water had extra thirst for heat. There's a simple test older than any handbook. Find a spot where the night breeze lifts the hairs on your forearm. If that little shiver arrives, you've found a place the dome will like. you're doing field science with goosebumps. Of course, none of this worked without routine. Someone had to sweep the floor, clear vents of dust, check for cracks, moisten surfaces at the right hour, and play referee between goats and water buckets. Remember the goat hair in the mortar? It doesn't mean the goats got a vote. But goats, being goats, probably tried to eat the straw insulation more than once. Consider that your third gentle joke for this stretch, because if you've ever shared a kitchen with a curious cat, you understand the ongoing negotiations between architecture and animals. What anchors you now is the calm logic of it all. Evaporation is patient. It doesn't demand much, only a little water and a path for the wind. The Persians made that path. They learned when to open, when to shade, when to sprinkle, when to seal. They harnessed an invisible exchange, heat swapped for dryness, and tucked their ice into that bargain. And just like that, the beehive becomes a lung, breathing out warmth, breathing in relief. As the evening deepens in your imagination, the dome cools another degree. You lean your back against it, and the surface answers with quiet composure. You think of the wind catchers down the street, of clay jars sweating gracefully on windowsills, of Canut water whispering underfoot, and of the way all these systems knit together into a climate of care. There's nothing flashy here, no clanking engines, blinking gauges, just a choreography of air and water and time. It's slow, like bedtime stories, like glaze forming on a winter pool, like your eyelids edging towards sleep. And if anyone asks tomorrow why a mud dome in a desert can keep ice, you'll shrug lazily and say, it makes the air thirsty. Which is not a lab report, but it is a decent lullaby. You linger in the shade of the dome, listening to the wind, and soon the hush draws your attention to the heart of the system, the place where all that carefully hauled and frozen snow would finally rest. You step down into the sloping passage, following the soft curve of earth until the light narrows behind you. The outside world fades, muffled by thick sarouge walls, and you find yourself in the cool chamber where ice lived through blistering summers. It's darker here, the air heavy with the smell of straw, clay, and damp stone. You shuffle forward cautiously, imagining stacks of ice blocks arranged like massive loaves of bread, each layer separated by mats of reeds. Villagers would have packed the underground pit carefully, layer after layer, like someone tucking away quilts in a cedar chest. And just like quilts, these frozen slabs weren't meant to be pulled out recklessly. Ice was precious, portioned slowly, monitored with care. You can almost picture a stern caretaker keeping a ledger. Who took how much, when, and for what purpose? The communal aspect of this space becomes obvious the longer you look around. This wasn't someone's private pantry. Entire neighborhoods depended on what lay beneath the dome. You imagine families waiting outside while their small share was fetched, perhaps a chipped block wrapped in cloth, carried home quickly before it melted. Ice-cooled food, soothed fevers, and kept gatherings bearable when the desert air pressed down like an anvil. It wasn't just about survival. It was about dignity. Being able to offer a guest a chilled drink in August was a statement. Our community works together, and we can spare comfort. Mainstream historians agree that communal icehouses existed across Persia, often managed by local officials or guilds who set the rules. But here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, small songs or chants were sung as ice was lowered into storage. A rhythm helped the workers coordinate, but it also turned heavy labor into a ritual. You picture the voices echoing softly against the dome, a kind of lullaby for the ice itself. Stay asleep until we need you, the notes seem to say. Historians still argue whether those chants were truly widespread or just the embellishments of later travelers, but the idea has a soothing charm, like humming to your refrigerator so it doesn't rattle. You crouch, tracing the floor with your fingers. A thin trickle of water runs along a groove toward a drainage pit. Meltwater was inevitable, so the builders designed slopes and sumps to collect and divert it. Nothing went to waste. The water could be used for irrigation or washing. Even the loss of ice carried usefulness. Imagine a mother scolding her child for slipping inside to lick at the dripping walls. If you're thirsty, Go drink from the kanat like everyone else. The chamber feels cavernous, though in reality it's the low light and thick air that magnify its presence. You whisper to yourself, and the sound returns slower, deeper, as if the dome insists on taking its time. In the corner, you picture straw piles stacked high, maybe an old clay jar tipped over from decades past, a fossil of everyday life. This place is both functional and oddly sacred, a vault of coolness in a landscape that tried constantly to snatch it away. Step back toward the entrance, and you notice how carefully the door was made, small, narrow, and positioned lower than the street outside. That meant hot air struggled to enter, and the interior remained undisturbed. If someone left the door open too long, you can imagine the entire neighborhood scolding them. Close it before you ruin everything. It's the same tone you use when someone in your household stands with the fridge open, staring blankly, as if the milk will magically change into cheesecake if given enough time. Some habits, apparently, are timeless. The communal aspect extended beyond the ice itself. Maintaining the yakshal was a collective responsibility. Families provided straw, labourers repaired cracks, water carriers kept the outer pools filled in winter. In return, everyone received their share of cold relief. It wasn't ownership, it was stewardship. And in that sense, the dome wasn't just a building, but a community promise. Historians still argue whether some yakuls charged fees or whether they were purely public goods supported by taxes or donations. The truth may be a mix, shifting with dynasty, town size, and wealth. A royal city might have levied a small fee, while a humble village simply shared what they could. You imagine both scenarios, a wealthy merchant slipping a coin to secure an extra block for his banquet, and a barefoot farmer accepting a chipped shard with gratitude. Even in the dim coolness, you sense the ritual of distribution. Early mornings might have been busiest, families lining up with baskets or cloth sacks, while the caretaker doled out chunks with deliberate precision. Maybe he carried a hooked tool, dragging blocks across the straw, muttering about waste and greedy hands. At night, when the air outside cooled, he might check the vents, sprinkle the walls, and settle the chamber like a shepherd watching over sleeping flocks. And though the ice itself was silent, the dome spoke in its own way. Every creak of settling straw, every drip into the drainage pit, every faint rustle in the dark reminded villagers that the balance was holding, that their summer lifeline was safe for another day. You step back outside, blinking at the harsh sun. The silence inside still lingers in your ears, soft as a sigh. You glance around and notice the dome isn't alone. In some cities, entire clusters of yakhals stood side by side, each serving a different neighborhood. They looked like a row of ancient chess pieces, unmoving yet full of potential. Together, they gave people the gift of choice. Water not boiling, fruit not spoiled, a breeze of luxury in a place where the desert expected only obedience. You let the thought sink in as the warm air presses back against your skin. Inside, it's cool enough to make you close your eyes. Outside, it's hot enough to make you open them. Between the two lies the communal promise, the understanding that no single person could keep ice alive here, but together they could. You walk away from the shaded dome for a moment, and almost immediately the heat presses against you like a heavy quilt you didn't ask for. The desert doesn't care about your comfort, but then you picture another world within this same land, the royal court, glittering with silks and perfumed air, where ice wasn't just for cooling melons but for dazzling guests. Tonight, you're drifting into the palaces of Persia, where sherbets sparkled in golden cups and ice became the star of feasts. Imagine the grand hall of a Safavid Shah lit by oil lamps, rugs stretched like oceans of pattern underfoot, and musicians plucking strings softly while servants glide across the floor. At the head of the hall sits the ruler, cool as a winter breeze in a landscape that should have roasted him. In his hand, a chilled drink made with mountain ice, pomegranate juice, and rosewater. It's not simply refreshment, it's theatre. Everyone watching knows the effort behind that single cup. Somewhere far away, men trudged down snowy passes, donkeys sagged under dripping loads, Villagers packed blocks into yakchals, and caretakers guarded them for months. All of that work melts now in one glittering sip. Mainstream historical sources tell us that Persian royalty loved to showcase abundance. Banquets featured tables heaped with rice, lamb, herbs, and sweets, but the true symbol of power was something harder to get than meat or jewels: coldness in summer. Guests were served iced syrups and fruit, chilled until their skins dewed with moisture. To be offered such a drink was to be told without words, "You are welcome in a kingdom where even the impossible is every day." Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Some Persian rulers were so fond of sherbets that they had favourite recipes written down, involving not just fruit juices but herbs, spices, and even ground almonds. A court poet once compared the taste of iced syrup to snow melting on the tongue while roses bloom in the heart. That's not exactly scientific language, but you have to admit it beats describing your lemonade as okay. Historians still argue whether these court recipes were innovations of Persia itself or adaptations from earlier Mesopotamian or Indian traditions. The debate continues like a quiet tug-of-war between scholars, each insisting their ancestors were the first to figure out that sugar plus snow equals delight. The performance didn't end with drinks. Imagine trays of chilled fruit, grapes, melons, figs, brought out in midsummer, their skins cold to the touch. Guests bite in, eyes widening, not just at the taste but at the sensation, cool juice running down the throat when outside air could fry an egg on the stones. Even the servants likely paused a second in awe before handing the plates over. In a culture that understood hospitality as both duty and art, this level of luxury wasn't just indulgence. It was diplomacy. You wander further into the imagined feast, your footsteps muffled by carpets. The courtiers murmur politely, eyes on the Shah's every gesture. Someone cracks a quiet joke about ice melting faster than a bribe, and the table chuckles nervously. Another guest marvels aloud at how the yakal near their town didn't last as long this year, blaming goats, weather, or simply bad luck. It seems even palace banquets couldn't escape the humour of everyday frustrations. One historian once suggested that ice at these events acted like fireworks at modern festivals, ephemeral, dazzling, impossible to ignore. You don't stare at a firework and think about the chemistry of combustion. You simply marvel that the sky has turned into glitter. In the same way, no one at the royal feast wanted to think about donkeys trudging through snow. They wanted to marvel at the miracle of a cold drink in the desert. Of course, the palace kept its secrets. Access to the largest yakchals and the freshest ice was tightly controlled. A villager might get a chipped block once a week, while a noble could have sherbets daily. This gap created its own kind of hierarchy. Not just wealth measured in jewels, but wealth measured in degrees of temperature. You begin to understand that ice, in its way, was currency. And yet the entire spectacle depended on the same communal labour you saw earlier. No Shah could sip chilled rosewater without the work of hundreds of anonymous people: snow carriers, straw cutters, bricklayers, water haulers. You wonder if those labourers ever joked about the absurdity. We freeze on the mountain so the Shah can stay cool at dinner. It's the kind of weary humour that probably hasn't changed in thousands of years. Historians still argue about how widespread these royal ice feasts truly were. Were they common events at every major banquet, or rare displays save for special diplomacy? The sources hint at both. Some travellers described them as regular marvels. Others mentioned them only in passing, as if to say, well, of course there was ice. That uncertainty lingers, and you picture scholars sipping lukewarm coffee, debating in air-conditioned libraries about who had ice, when, and how often. You return to the present image, the hall glowing, the Shah lifting his cup, the guests watching frost shimmer on fruit bowls. Outside, the desert winds stir dust into the night, but inside, the air seems softened by the presence of impossible cold. You, too, lift an imaginary cup, condensation sliding down your fingers, and sip the sweetness that centuries of ingenuity have placed in your hand. The music slows, The courtier's laughter fades, and you lean back against a cushion, lulled by the thought that humans, no matter their station, have always chased the same fleeting joys: sweetness, coolness, and the satisfaction of sharing both with someone else. You linger a little longer in that banquet hall of the imagination, but the scene begins to drift. The Shah's sherbet fades, the courtiers dissolve like sugar in water, and now you're drawn to the sweet inventions that spread from those icy palaces into kitchens, marketplaces, and homes. The real magic of Persian ice wasn't only in the spectacle of kings, it was in the recipes, the syrups, the little culinary flourishes that trickled down into daily life. Picture yourself in a busy bazaar, the air thick with spices and roasting lamb, vendors shouting half-heartedly because the heat is enough to mute enthusiasm. And yet from one corner stall there's a sound like delighted laughter. You drift closer, and there it is, a large ceramic bowl packed with chipped ice, its surface gleaming with fruit syrups, rosewater, maybe even saffron for those who can afford the luxury. The merchant grins at you, scoops a little of the mixture into a cup, and hands it over. The first sip tastes like snow dressed in perfume. Mainstream historians agree that Persia played a central role in refining the art of sherbets, sweet drinks flavored with fruit, herbs, and flowers. The word sherbet itself comes from the Arabic sharbat, meaning drink, but Persia gave it much of its romantic association. With ice in the picture, sherbets weren't just beverages, they were experiences. Rosewater syrup over snow, lemon mixed with mint, pomegranate chilled until it felt like biting into rubies. These were the simple miracles of summer. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some sources mention that Persians experimented with syrups so concentrated they resembled sticky jams. These could be stored without spoiling, then thinned with water and poured over ice whenever a quick refreshment was needed. In a way, it was the ancestor of your flavoured syrups at a modern coffee bar. Except, instead of ordering a pumpkin spice latte, you'd say, "Please, more quince syrup," over that block of mountain snow. Historians still argue whether these syrups were originally developed for medicinal use or purely for pleasure. Ancient healers often prescribed sweet syrups mixed with herbs for ailments, and adding ice may have been the natural next step. As you wander the bazaar, you notice children darting between stalls, each clutching a small cup of chipped ice drenched in syrup, their lips sticky and red like tiny pomegranates themselves. A mother scolds her son for spilling half of his sherbet on his tunic, while the boy simply grins and shovels more into his mouth. You can't help but laugh quietly. Some things never change. If you've ever eaten a snow cone and ended up wearing half of it, you're in good company. The sensory experience becomes your lullaby tonight. The clink of ceramic ladles against bowls, the drip of melting ice, the fragrance of roses mingling with citrus. Somewhere, a street musician plucks at a setar, the notes weaving with the calls of hawkers selling fresh bread. You take another sip, and the cold runs down your throat, startling at first, then deeply comforting. Food scholars note that the Persian love of sherbets influenced many other cultures. From the Mughal courts of India to the Ottoman palaces of Istanbul, icy syrups became fashionable. Recipes travelled, adapted and multiplied, turning into everything from kulfi to sorbet. But here in this bazaar, it's still simple. Chipped ice, sweet syrup and laughter. You get the sense that these flavours carried people through unbearable heat, offering a pocket of winter in the middle of summer's blaze. Historians still argue about how accessible these treats were to common folk. Some claim sherbets were mostly a luxury, reserved for nobility and the wealthy. Others point out that once ice houses became common in larger towns, ordinary citizens could enjoy them at festivals or special occasions. Perhaps the truth lies in between. Not everyday indulgence, but not entirely out of reach either. You picture yourself saving a little coin just for that one treat in July, savouring each bite slowly, knowing it might be weeks before you can taste it again. And it wasn't only about sweetness. Some recipes mixed in herbs like basil or mint for a cooling effect, both on the tongue and in the body. Persian medical texts praised chilled drinks for reducing fevers and calming restlessness. You remember the physician's hand you imagined earlier, prescribing compresses. Now he's also recommending a rosewater sherbet to soothe the heart. You can see why patients would suddenly feel better. The bazaar hums, the sherbet vendor wipes his brow, and you realize how deeply the idea of cold sweetness seeped into Persian culture. Poets wrote verses comparing lovers to chilled wine, to snow kissed by fruit. Musicians sang of longing quenched like thirst with sherbet. Even religious gatherings sometimes offered cool drinks as symbols of hospitality and purity. Ice wasn't just a physical relief, it was a metaphor. You step out of the noisy bazaar and follow the thought further down the road, literally down the camel road. The sherbet vendors are gone, the songs fade, and you're left with the long groan of caravans carrying more than spices and silks. They're hauling ice itself, the most unlikely cargo in the desert. You squint against the horizon and see a line of camels swaying like ships on a golden sea, bundles lashed to their humps, straw poking out from the sides. The idea of ice riding across Persia feels absurd, like delivering umbrellas in a hurricane, and yet here it is. Caravan ice trade wasn't the main way most Persians got their frozen luxury, but it happened often enough to leave an imprint. Mainstream historians describe blocks of ice wrapped in layers of straw mats, then draped with wool or felt. The insulation slowed the melting, though you know it never stopped it entirely. Every mile of desert meant another trickle lost. Traders had to balance speed, shade, and survival. Too slow, and the load melted into nothing. Too fast, and the camels collapsed. Imagine yourself walking beside one of those camels. The pack creaks, dripping faintly, leaving a trail of dampness across the dust. Villagers sometimes followed behind with pots and jars, scooping up the meltwater, joking that they were buying the leftovers at a discount. One caravan master, tired of jokes, might mutter, "Yes, it's water, but it's water that started as snow, and that makes it worth twice as much." The desert has its own brand of logic. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, ice was considered valuable enough to be escorted with guards, not because anyone wanted to steal ice for themselves, but because rival towns might sabotage shipments. A clever thief didn't need to carry off blocks, just poke holes in the wrapping, or delay the caravan until the sun did the work. Imagine a group of mischief-makers lurking behind dunes, armed not with swords, but with sticks and grins, planning the world's most inconvenient heist. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerated tales told by nervous traders or genuine accounts of ice rivalry. Either way, they add a chilly edge to an otherwise melting business. Caravanserais, roadside inns that dotted Persia's trade routes, played a role here too. These way stations offered not just food and rest for travellers, but shaded courtyards where ice shipments could pause. Picture camels kneeling in the dust, relieved of their burdens, while workers rushed to repack melting blocks, drain excess water, and reinforce the straw insulation. Somewhere in the corner, a merchant is already selling chipped pieces to tired travellers, turning every delay into a profit. You imagine reaching one such inn at dusk. The desert sky bleeds into orange and purple, shadows stretching across the courtyard. A few blocks of ice are lifted out, smaller than when they left the mountain, but still miraculous. A jug of syrup is poured, a handful of chipped ice dropped in, and suddenly the weary traders have their reward. The first sip cools not only the body, but the endless complaints about blisters and dust. Even camels seem to sigh, though perhaps that's just your imagination turning their chewing into gratitude. Mainstream scholarship ties much of this ice movement to wealthier patrons. Nobles, merchants, and city governors could afford to pay for the loss along the way. By the time ice reached distant cities, its value was measured not just in weight, but in survival. A block that started as 50 kilos might arrive as 20, but it was 20 kilos of solid wealth. Owning the right to distribute it was a statement of power. Historians still argue about the scale of this trade. Some claim it was occasional, only for special feasts and diplomatic gestures. Others suggest it was more routine in prosperous cities, with caravans scheduled like clockwork each season. The truth may lie in between. Not an everyday sight for commoners, but not rare enough to be a miracle either. You imagine that if you were a child in the desert, the arrival of a caravan with ice would be enough to keep you wide-eyed all night. The thought makes you chuckle. Somewhere along the route, a merchant surely tried to advertise his shipment with flair. Come taste snow in summer. Imported freshness straight from the mountains. It sounds suspiciously like a modern bottled water slogan, proof that some sales pitches never go out of style. And yet, beneath the humour, there's a deeper rhythm. These caravans wove ice into the same trade networks that carried cinnamon from India, glass from Rome, and silk from China. Ice was both fragile and fleeting, but it joined the list of goods that proved humans could outwit geography. It's one thing to trade spices that sit politely in a sack for months. It's another to drag a block of frozen water through an environment designed to destroy it. That stubbornness makes the taste at the end all the sweeter. As night falls in your vision, the caravanserai cools. The last light glints on damp straw bundles. Traders lie back against their packs, camels snore in their own camel way, and the air smells faintly of both sweat and snow. You sip the last of your sherbet, amused at how a block of ice that began as mountain snow can end as a bedtime story. And tomorrow the caravan will rise, sway back into the desert and chase the horizon all over again. The caravan fades into the night behind you, and when you open your eyes again, the desert has changed. The air is alive with laughter, drums, and the soft glow of lanterns strung between mud-brick walls. You've wandered into midsummer, when entire towns gathered for festivals, and ice wasn't just a secret hoarded in domes or a luxury sipped by kings. It was the centerpiece of celebration. Imagine the scene. Long tables stretched beneath the stars, neighbors sitting shoulder to shoulder, children weaving between them with sticky hands. At the center of it all sits a block of glittering frost, hauled from the Yakal earlier that day, chipping away in the evening warmth. People gather around, marveling at its endurance as though it were a visiting guest. Someone dips a ladle into a bowl of chilled syrup and pours it across the block, letting the liquid harden slightly before cracking it into shards. Children squeal, adults chuckle, and even the town elder, who pretends to be unimpressed, sneaks a taste when no one's looking. Mainstream historians agree that Persian culture wove festivals around the rhythms of seasons, and summer gatherings often included foods and drinks that showcased ice. Sherbets were shared freely, fruits cooled until they seemed to glow, and guests were invited to refresh themselves not just with sustenance, but with wonder. The arrival of ice at a midsummer festival was proof that the town had planned well, stored wisely, and cared for its people. Here's your quirky tidbit. Travellers from outside Persia sometimes wrote with amazement about seeing children skate on small frozen pools created near Yakhals in winter. Months later, those same pools' ice would appear at summer festivals, chipped into drinks or shaped into playful sculptures. Imagine the delight of a child in July, realizing the ice they once slipped on was now flavouring their sherbet. Historians still argue whether such continuity was intentional storytelling by adults or simply a coincidence noticed by children, but it's charming either way. As you stroll through this imagined festival, you notice the sensory overload. Roasted meat sizzling on skewers, smoke curling into the night air, the fragrance of mint, rose water and honey drifting from sherbet bowls, the cool touch of clay cups pressed into your palm. Music floats above it all, drums, flutes, clapping rhythms. The desert sky above is endless, filled with stars that look like spilled salt, and for once the heat feels bearable. The presence of ice transforms the mood. Normally, the desert evening carries the day's residue of heat, pressing people into weary silence. But tonight, every chilled sip lifts the weight a little. Neighbours lean closer, gossip flows more freely, jokes land louder. You hear someone quip that the ice is melting faster than his patience with goats, and another answers that at least goats don't charge by the block. The crowd laughs, proving once again that humour thrives best when accompanied by refreshment. You make your way toward the Yakhal itself, which looms in the distance, lit faintly by torches. The dome feels less like an architectural oddity tonight, and more like a sacred granary of coldness. People treat it with respect, even reverence. One family bows briefly before its door, murmuring thanks for its bounty. Another group takes turns carrying baskets of straw back inside, sealing away the rest of the ice for later days. In that moment, the dome is not just a storage unit, it's a guardian, honored like a participant in the celebration. Historians still argue whether these festivals had direct ties to religious rituals, or whether they were purely social gatherings. Some sources suggest that offering guests chilled drinks carried symbolic weight, representing hospitality elevated to divine duty. Others see it as a straightforward civic celebration of resourcefulness. Perhaps, as with most traditions, the truth was both. Practical survival and spiritual gratitude met under the same lantern light. Your eyes catch the sight of dancers now, children spinning in circles, their movements quick and chaotic, adults swaying more slowly, careful not to spill their cups. A musician strikes up a new rhythm, faster, more insistent, and the crowd claps along. Even the older villagers smile, caught in the moment. The presence of ice seems to ripple outward like a blessing, cooling tempers, easing burdens, and smoothing the rough edges of daily hardship. As the night deepens, the block at the center shrinks. It drips steadily into the sand, forming a dark patch beneath the table. A few children crouch close, catching droplets in their palms, pretending it's magic water. And maybe in their eyes it is. By dawn the ice will be gone, but tonight it has given them a story to carry forward, one they'll tell with laughter years later. Remember the night the sherbet overflowed and Uncle tripped over the jug? That kind of tale that bonds families across time. And when the festival finally winds down, lanterns flickering, drums fading, you find yourself walking home with the villagers. The desert night cools, but not as much as the memory of ice on your tongue. That memory lingers, sweeter than any syrup, a gentle promise that even in the hottest places, humans will always find reasons to gather, to laugh, and to savor the impossible. You slip away from the lantern-lit square and wander the alleys where everyday life invents its own little miracles. Not everything needs a monumental dome to wrestle comfort from heat. Sometimes it's a damp cloth, a clay jar, and a patient breeze doing the quiet work while no one claps. You pause at a doorway where a curtain of woven reeds hangs, still dripping from a recent splash. The air behind it is a shade cooler, just enough to make shoulders drop. You pass through, and the reed scent, earthy, grassy, mixes with the evening dust like a homemade cologne the desert approves of. A family courtyard opens before you, brick walls, a scrap of sky, a fig tree gamely exhaling shade. In the centre sits an earthenware jar perched in a shallow dish. The pot is porous, beaded with fine droplets. The dish catches the slow tears. Someone has laid a palm fan beside it, ready for a neighbourly gust or a bored child's fidget. You kneel and touch the jar, cool to the fingers, as if it stores a private autumn. This is the simplest of Persian cooling tricks. Let water seep through clay, let evaporation steal the heat, and the drink inside becomes a polite shrug at summer. Mainstream historians point out that households across Iran and beyond use these porous jars as everyday refrigerators, especially where Kanat water, cool and shaded underground, could be kept moving nearby. You imagine a mother lifting the lid, pouring a ladle of water into a cup with a soft clink, and passing it to a son who pretends he isn't impressed, even as his eyes say otherwise. It's the same act you've seen in a modern kitchen. Open door, take sip, sigh contentedly. Except here, the door is clay, and the sigh belongs to the wind. You lean closer and notice strips of cloth hanging from the jar's neck, wicks that trail into the dish. They draw water upward, keep the outer skin of the vessel continuously damp, and turn the jar into a low-tech air conditioner. Someone adds a slow sweep of the palm fan, and the breeze negotiates a better temperature, a degree or two at a time. The joke writes itself. A deluxe upgraded cooling system with manual oscillation and zero noise mode, powered by the elbow of the nearest uncle. Near the fig tree, a woven sling hangs from a beam, cradling two melons that sway like lazy pendulums. Their skins are damp. A teenager sprinkles them again, and droplets race along the netting before falling to the tiles. Chilling melons becomes an art here. Hang them where air flows, or lower them in a basket toward the courtyard cistern, the water licking warmth from the rind. A grandmother taps one with a knuckle, thunk, listens for the right note, then nods. You're witnessing a home orchestra where the conductor is evaporation and the instruments are fruit. The canut murmurs underfoot, not visible but present, in the way the air tastes faintly like stone and shade. In some houses, channels were led deliberately along a wall or beneath a floor to temper rooms. No need to see the water when its coolness hums through clay. You settle on a low stool and imagine the flow, mountain-fed, roofed with earth for miles, gliding into towns like a guest who knows how to arrive quietly. Historians still argue whether certain courtyard layouts were optimized primarily for cooling or simply for privacy and prayer, with cooling as a lucky bonus. The truth, you suspect, is a friendly handshake between function and faith, calm spaces that also happen to feel kind in July. There's a narrow doorway ahead with a grill of carved plaster. Someone has draped a wet muslin over it, and the air slipping in becomes a gentle sigh, filtered, cooled, and sweetened by the faint mineral scent of the cloth. The house cat sprawls right there, belly up, having discovered the prime spot ages before any human. You smile. In a world full of engineering, cats remain the original placement consultants. That's joke number 2 for your drowsy ledger, and the cat doesn't mind. Across the courtyard, you catch the hushed performance of a bargee, a wind-catcher tower whose open mouth faces the nightly breeze. The tower's throat funnels air down a shaft where it skims a splash pool before wandering through rooms like a polite guest, hands washed, voice low. You stand beneath the draft and feel the difference, a slow brush of coolness, not dramatic, not showy, but persistent. It's the same principle the Yakchal loves, just translated into vertical poetry. A child holds a ribbon under the vent to watch it flutter, and you briefly think that if ribbons had opinions, they'd give 5 stars to Persian airflow. On a shelf, 2 clay bowls sit inside a larger basin, and between them a layer of damp sand, another humble trick. The inner bowl holds what matters, fresh cheese, herbs, maybe a precious fig jam, and the damp sand migrates chill inward as it dries. A careful hand adds water periodically, like winding a clock. Time and temperature stretch together, unhurried, unimpressed by the day's theatrics. You picture night approaching, and with it another sleight of hand you've met before. Shallow trays set in the open yard to flirt with the stars. Radiative cooling loves a clear sky, and though we shy away from equations at bedtime, you feel the spell. The trays talk to cold space while the earth keeps close counsel, and by dawn a skin of ice forms in winter, or at least a generous coolness in summer. The same principle, scaled down, serves supper. A pot set on the terrace, a damp cloth draped over it, and sky-borrowed chill seeping in while the neighborhood sleeps. Here's your quirky tidbit for this stretch. Some households hung narrow water skins high in doorways, so the evening draught had to pass through them, like wind playing a stringed instrument made of leather. The air came through cooled and a little perfumed, and the rhythmic dripping onto a saucer below became a kind of domestic metronome. If you've ever listened to a white noise app with gentle water selected, congratulations, you've reinvented a medieval doorway. You pause by the reed curtain again and listen to the house breathe. A father shuffles past with a tray of cups. A mother checks the jar, then the melons, then smiles to herself, satisfied by degrees that would escape a thermometer, but not a practiced hand. Cooling here is a ritual of small consistencies. Rehydrate the cloth, fan the jar, shift the sling to catch the breeze, open the windcatcher mouth a finger's width more. None of it shouts. All of it works. Historians still argue whether certain famous courtyards with rills and fountains, think of salsable runnels over carved stone, were primarily symbolic paradise gardens or microclimates engineered to make conversation and prayer easier in heat. You stand where water sheathes itself thinly across a ribbed chute and breaks into 1,000 little fingers of air. The effect is both theological and thermodynamic. devotion that lowers the temperature by a whisper. Paradises, it turns out, can also be practical. And yes, there are mishaps because people are people. Someone inevitably forgets to re-wet the cloth on the hottest afternoon. Someone else leaves the lid ajar and invites a curious wasp. A boy swings the melon sling like a pendulum and nearly baptizes the courtyard in fruit. Laughter follows, then towels, then the quiet return to routine. Consider that your third soft joke of the night, the universe's reminder that even the best designs bend around human hands. By the time moonlight finds the fig leaves, you've learned a truth the Yakul only hinted at. Survival in the desert is not a single invention, but a chorus. Clay, cloth, shade, breeze, water, each sings a part, and together they make a room feel habitable, a drink taste kinder, a body remember patience. You breathe in, cool enough to notice, warm enough to relax, and think, this is what ingenuity does when it moves into a house and decides to stay for dinner. The courtyard fades behind you, its fig tree and swinging melons dissolving into the night, and soon you find yourself in another kind of quiet chamber. This one doesn't hum with conversation or ripple with laughter. Instead, it smells of herbs, dried mint, fennel, saffron, and the faint, crisp sting of vinegar. You've stepped into the domain of the healer, where ice takes on another role, medicine. Picture a patient lying on a mat, sweat gleaming across their forehead. The summer heat has struck hard and fever grips them. Around them, family members fan urgently with woven palm leaves. But then the healer, a calm figure with a long robe and ink-stained fingers, gestures for quiet. From a small chest he withdraws a wrapped bundle. Straw rustles, cloth parts, and a miracle emerges, a chipped block of ice, fogging the air around it. Gasps fill the room. The healer presses a compress of cloth against the block until it stiffens with cold, then lays it gently on the patient's brow. The body sighs, and for a moment the fever seems less relentless. Mainstream historical texts remind us that Persian physicians, like the famous Avicenna, studied not only herbs but also the properties of temperature in treatment. Cold was prescribed to balance the humours, to soothe inflammation, to bring relief where heat dominated. Ice, rare as it was, became a tool in the healer's kit. You imagine a physician scribbling notes by lamplight. For restless sleep, apply chilled cloth to temples. For excessive thirst, sip sherbet of quince and snow. Whether it worked physiologically or simply calmed the spirit, the ritual mattered. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some accounts, chilled drinks weren't only for the sick, but also for the sleepless. A cup of snow-cooled syrup at night was believed to quiet the heart and ease the mind. Picture yourself tossing and turning on a summer evening, then being handed a sip of pomegranate sherbet so cold it numbs your teeth. Suddenly the bed feels softer, the walls less suffocating. It's essentially the 10th century version of your midnight glass of water, only with rosewater and bragging rights. Historians still argue whether these remedies were rooted in real effectiveness or mostly in placebo, but either way they reveal a truth. Relief is as much about belief as it is about temperature. You watch as the healer moves with practiced patience. He dips cloths, folds them, presses them to pulse points on wrists and ankles. The patient stirs, murmurs thanks, and drifts into a calmer sleep. Around the mat, family members exchange relieved glances. They know the ice won't cure everything, but it buys comfort, and in the desert, comfort is medicine enough. On another day, you see the healer mix herbs into syrups, store them in glazed jars, then drizzle them over chipped ice. Mint for cooling, licorice root for easing throats, violets for calming coughs. Each spoonful is both treatment and treat, blurring the line between pharmacy and refreshment stand. The child who resists bitter herbs suddenly becomes compliant when the medicine arrives wrapped in snow. You nod knowingly. It's the same trick modern parents use with honey and lemon, except here it's rosewater over ice. Even animals sometimes benefited. One villager tells you about placing cold cloths on overheated donkeys, another about offering chilled water to faltering camels. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories echo a broader wisdom. Ice was not a luxury when illness loomed. It was the boundary between collapse and resilience, between despair and a few more days of hope. Historians still argue about how widely available this medical ice was. Some claim it remained almost entirely the privilege of elites, dispensed only in cities with large yakkals. Others insist that even small villages found ways to share modest amounts during crises, pooling resources for the sick. The truth may lie in the way communities already treated their yakchals as collective lifelines. To save ice for feasts alone while children burned with fever seems unlikely. Survival has a way of rewriting priorities. The healer's room grows quiet now. The patient sleeps more evenly, chest rising and falling like a calmer tide. The block of ice sweats away in its corner, dripping slowly into a bowl. Each drop is precious, each one a reminder that relief is fleeting but real. You watch the healer cover the remaining ice with cloth and return it to its chest, guarding it for the next urgent call. Stepping outside, the night air feels warmer again, but the memory of that chilled compress lingers on your skin. You think of modern hospitals with humming refrigerators, sterile packs of ice ready on demand, and you realize how radical it must have felt for a desert healer to press winter itself against a fevered brow. 1,000 years later, the sensation is the same: coolness easing heat, relief softening fear. You walk past houses with shaded jars and wind catchers, but now you know that behind some of those walls, a child is sleeping soundly, thanks not only to herbs and prayers, but to a sliver of mountain snow, saved and shared with care. That knowledge, soft and steady, might be the best lullaby of all. You drift back through the narrow lanes, past fig trees and reed curtains, until the village opens into a small square. There, perched on a stone bench, an old poet hums to himself, his eyes fixed on the distant Yakshal dome glowing under the moon. He isn't thinking about fevers or fruit. For him, ice has always been more than a utility. It's a symbol, a metaphor, a language of its own. You pause, and in his voice you hear the cultural life of frozen water, the way Persians wrapped meaning around coldness, like silk around the body. In Persian poetry, ice often stood for purity, clarity, or restraint. Imagine a lover described as snow on the mountain, untouchable, distant, beautiful in stillness. Sherbet cooled with ice became a poetic shorthand for relief after longing, a drink that quenched not just thirst but the ache of absence. One 14th century verse likens the smile of a beloved to snow melting on the tongue, sudden, fleeting, gone too soon. Mainstream historians note how often metaphors of coldness appear in Persian literature, in contrast to the relentless heat of daily life. To imagine cold was to imagine another world, almost heavenly. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Sufi mystics use the Yakchal itself as metaphor in sermons. The dome's cool depths became a symbol for the heart kept pure, insulated from the heat of worldly desire. Store your faith like ice in straw. One preacher supposedly said, so it does not melt under the sun of greed. Whether or not the phrase is apocryphal, you have to admit it's a memorable piece of spiritual advice, half sermon, half refrigerator manual. Historians still argue whether such metaphors were widespread or just colourful anecdotes preserved in later retellings, but they reveal how deeply ice seeped into imagination. You picture a summer gathering where poets recite under the stars. The crowd murmurs with appreciation as verses link chilled sherbets with divine mercy, or ice with the endurance of love. Someone laughs softly when a jokester compares his stingy neighbour to a block of ice, cold and unwilling to share. Humour and reverence mingle easily, proving that symbols are as versatile as the snow that birthed them. Socially, too, ice spoke a language. To serve a guest a chilled drink was to declare respect, even affection. Hospitality is sacred in Persian culture, and offering something as improbable as ice in midsummer elevated that duty to art. Imagine visiting a friend and being handed a bowl of grapes so cold they mist in the air. The act itself whispers, I thought of you when the Yakchal door opened. It's not extravagance, it's intimacy. In markets, the presence of chipped ice at a vendor's stall could be an advertisement for prosperity. Buyers paused, impressed, knowing this merchant had the connections to procure something rare. Even the sound of ice clinking in a cup became shorthand for privilege. Children imitated it with pebbles, rattling them in clay bowls, pretending they were nobles sipping sherbet. It's the same impulse that makes a child today pretend a juice box is a latte, playful mimicry of status wrapped in innocence. That's your second gentle joke of the night, and you grin at the thought. Religious imagery joined in too. In Islamic texts, paradise is described as gardens beneath which rivers flow, shaded, cool, abundant. In the desert, such descriptions bloom vividly. Some storytellers linked chilled sherbets at feasts with glimpses of paradise, moments when the unbearable heat gave way to a taste of eternal comfort. Ice, in this sense, was a prophecy in miniature, a reminder that endurance in this world leads to refreshment in the next. Historians still argue whether ice's symbolism leaned more heavily on notions of purity or luxury. Was it revered as a divine gift, proof that even deserts contain hidden mercy? Or was it flaunted as an emblem of human triumph, a sign that kings could bend nature's rules? Both interpretations live side by side, like two streams flowing into one pool. What matters is that ice never stayed silent. It always meant something. You imagine walking past a wedding feast, where the bride and groom are offered chilled pomegranate juice. Guests cheer, the couple sip, and laughter rings out. Everyone knows the drink is cold, not by accident, but by careful planning. In that moment, the ice is more than ice. It's blessing, joy, and pride made tangible. And perhaps when the poet later describes the marriage, he'll call it a sherbet in the desert of life, sweet, improbable, treasured. The dome of the Yakhul looms again in your vision, quiet under the moon. You realize that for centuries people didn't just see it as storage. They saw it as a symbol of resilience, a monument to the balance between human effort and divine generosity. In its shadow, families told stories, poets found metaphors, and preachers pointed to lessons. The dome wasn't just a building. It was a cultural mirror, reflecting whatever meaning people poured into it. As you settle yourself on the stone bench beside the poet, you hear his final line drift into the night. Snow in the desert, like love in hardship, melts quickly but leaves sweetness behind. You close your eyes, letting that image rest against you like a cool cloth, and you realize you're no longer just learning history, you're sipping it. The poet's voice fades and you rise once more, following the call of a broader world. Beyond Persia's borders, other lands looked on with curiosity. Travelers carried stories, recipes, and sometimes even ice itself across deserts and seas. Soon you find yourself at a caravanserai, crowded not just with camels and straw bundles, but with foreign tongues. Greek, Arabic, even the clipped syllables of traders from India. Ice wasn't just a Persian treasure, it was a cultural export. Imagine a Syrian merchant, wide-eyed after seeing a yakhul for the first time. He returns home telling friends about inverted beehives that breathe cold air from their sides. A Greek physician, already familiar with snow brought down from Mount Olympus, hears of Persian sherbets and scribbles in his notes, flavoured snow drinks, medicinal and pleasant. And an Indian traveller, no stranger to chilled mango pulp in northern courts, marvels at the desert ingenuity that makes coolness appear where mountains are far away. Mainstream historians recognize Persia's role in influencing icy traditions across the Islamic world. Ottoman sultans in Istanbul later demanded sherbets cooled with mountain ice. Mughal emperors in India refined the art into kulfi, frozen milk desserts flavored with cardamom and pistachios. The path winds back to Persia, where the practical wisdom of storage and the poetry of sherbets first joined hands. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval European travellers tried to explain yakhul's back home and were laughed at. A building that stores snow in the desert? Skeptics scoffed. Impossible. Yet centuries later, when European elites discovered ice houses for themselves, the tune changed. By the 17th century, French nobles were eating sorbets, and Italians were making gelato. It turns out those Persian sherbets had cousins who would go on to conquer the modern dessert menu. Historians still argue whether the word sorbet itself came directly through Persian sharbat or via Arabic. Either way, every scoop of lemon sorbet today whispers faintly of desert domes and donkey caravans. You stroll into an imagined Ottoman court. Here sherbet fountains burble, gold cups brim with chilled drinks, and foreign envoys raise eyebrows. "You keep ice in midsummer too?" one ambassador asks. The Ottoman host smiles knowingly. "Yes, and we sweeten it with violets." Persian influence hums beneath the exchange, proof that ideas flow faster than caravans. Then you find yourself at the Mughal court in India. Servants bring out frozen desserts in small clay molds, cracked open to reveal creamy kulfi. The emperor tastes, nods, and recites poetry comparing the dessert to moonlight solidified. Behind the indulgence stands Persian heritage, carried through scholars, artisans, and trade. Once again, snow in summer becomes both nourishment and metaphor. In Europe, the transition feels slower, but you see hints of it in Venetian markets where merchants sell icy cordials inspired by Eastern tales. You picture a Venetian noble dipping his spoon into frozen wine and announcing, with more drama than necessary, a miracle. His servant, unimpressed, mutters under his breath that Persians had been doing this for centuries. There's your first gentle joke of the section, history reminding us that bragging rights are as fragile as melting ice. Historians still argue whether these cross-cultural influences were direct or if different civilizations stumbled on similar ideas independently. Did Persians directly inspire Italian sorbet? Or did both cultures simply experiment with snow and sugar until they reached similar delights? The debate continues, like two neighbors claiming they each invented the hammock first. What can't be denied is that Persia's expertise in storing ice set a precedent admired far beyond its deserts. You step into a modern kitchen for just a moment, watching someone pull a pint of pistachio ice cream from a freezer. The spoon digs in, the first bite melts creamy and cold. Few pause to think that this simple comfort has ancestors who clinked ceramic ladles in Persian bazaars. Tonight, you do pause. Every frozen dessert feels like a postcard from a Yakhal dome, mailed across centuries. The world shrinks in your imagination. A Sufi poet in Shiraz compares sherbet to divine bliss. An Ottoman scribe describes the logistics of ice houses near Istanbul. A French courtier in Versailles demands sorbet at his banquet. All of them are linked by one quiet technology, the art of saving winter for summer. And now, as you step away from courts and caravanserais, you hear a faint refrain, the persistence of humans in chasing coolness, not just for survival but for joy. A pursuit that began with Persians hauling snow into domes, eventually left its trace in gelaterias, soda fountains, and corner shops with humming freezers. The circle widens, but the heartbeat is the same. Cold sweetness, fleeting and profound. You smile as you leave the imagined Mughal palace, the imagined Venetian banquet, and return to the desert night. The Yakhal dome still glows faintly, but now it feels bigger than one culture. It's the ancestor of every frosty sip and creamy scoop you've ever enjoyed. The desert taught the world how to taste snow. You step back beneath the shadow of the dome, but this time your gaze drifts forward, not backward. Centuries slide past like sand in an hourglass, and you watch the role of the Yakhal change as new tools hum into being. The whisper of kanats, the creak of caravans, these begin to fade under the drone of machines. Electricity arrives, and with it the refrigerator. At first the old domes stand proudly, still storing what villages need. In some towns, they continue their quiet work into the 20th century. Families open their straw-lined chests, scoop ice, and live as they always have. But gradually metal doors click shut, thermostats buzz, and coolness is summoned by wires instead of wind. The Yakhal, once a marvel, becomes background. You imagine a teenager rolling his eyes when his grandfather says, "In my day, we carried snow down from the mountains." The boy points at the humming fridge and says, "Great story, but my water's already cold." That's your first soft joke of the night, proof that technology always breeds impatience. Mainstream historians note that many Yakhals fell into disuse during the 20th century. Some collapsed, their domes crumbling under neglect. Others were repurposed as storage sheds or even playgrounds, children scrambling up their steep sides like ants on a sugar loaf. Yet not all were abandoned. A few communities continued to use them seasonally, valuing the independence they offered. Electricity could fail, machines could break, but the dome never demanded fuel beyond sun, wind, and patience. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns during the 1960s, people joked about Persian refrigerators without plugs, referring to yakchals that still worked better than cheap modern appliances. One traveller recorded a villager tapping his old dome proudly and saying, "This one has never burned out a fuse." You can almost hear the dry humour in his voice, part sarcasm, part pride. Historians still argue whether such anecdotes were resistance to modernization or simply affection for a familiar technology. By the late 20th century, yakchuls began to attract a new kind of visitor. Not villagers hauling ice, but archaeologists and architects sketching their forms. Tourists paused with cameras, marvelling at how something so ancient still looked futuristic, conical, geometric, strangely elegant against the desert. Scholars measured the thickness of Saruj walls, marvelled at the efficiency of passive cooling, and compared them to modern green technologies. What had once been everyday survival now looked like innovation, ahead of its time. You picture yourself standing in one of these domes in the 1980s, dust swirling through broken vents. Children's laughter echoes as they chase each other around the pit where ice once lay. A grandmother shakes her head at the noise, muttering that the children have no idea what those walls once held. You run your hand along the plaster, feeling its roughness, and realize you're touching both past and future. Modern engineers sometimes sketch yakchals when designing sustainable housing. The principles, thick insulation, underground storage, airflow manipulation, are timeless. In a world anxious about energy use, the old domes suddenly seem wise again. Architects whisper about reviving their lessons, building new homes that breathe like yakals. You can almost imagine a glossy brochure, ancient Persian cooling, now with Wi-Fi. That's your second gentle joke, tucked between blueprints and nostalgia. Historians still argue whether we should treat yakchals primarily as heritage sites to be preserved or as blueprints to be adapted. Some say they belong in museums protected under glass. Others argue they should inspire living technologies, returning as community coolers in regions without stable power. The debate is ongoing, and you feel the irony. Once again, people are quarrelling over how best to keep things from melting. You walk around a restored yakchal, its surface patched and gleaming under a fresh coat of plaster. Signs explain its function, tourists murmur appreciatively, and a guide waves toward the dome with pride. Nearby, an ice cream cart hums with modern electricity, selling pistachio scoops to visitors who take selfies in front of the very building that made such indulgence possible centuries ago. Past and present collide, deliciously. In some villages, elders still tell children bedtime stories about the days when families lined up for their portion of ice. They point to the dome and say, "That is where your summer water once came from." Children listen, half incredulous, half enchanted. For them, cold water flows from a tap, sherbet comes from a refrigerator. But the dome glows in their imagination, a reminder that comfort was once something to be built, tended, and shared. You step back from the yakchal one last time. Its shadow stretches long, touching the wires of modern street lamps, brushing the hum of distant air conditioners. The old dome doesn't compete, it simply stands. Silent, patient, reminding the world that ingenuity doesn't always need electricity. Sometimes it only needs clay, wind, and the will to wait. The night air cools slightly, and you breathe in, realizing that history has circled around again. What was once ordinary is now extraordinary. What was once survival is now inspiration. And somewhere in between, you're caught smiling at the thought that an ancient dome might outlast every humming fridge you've ever owned. The restored dome stands behind you, and now you let your imagination drift one final time, not into history, but into possibility. The yakchal, once a dusty relic of desert towns, becomes a spark for the future. You walk through a landscape where ancient cones rise again, not as ruins, but as living companions to modern life. Picture a new village built on the edge of an expanding desert. Solar panels glitter on rooftops, but beside them stand freshly plastered yakchal domes. their walls thick with sarouj, just like centuries ago. Children race around them as if they were playground hills, while inside the pits once again hold ice. This time, though, the ice isn't just from mountain snow. It's produced by solar-powered pumps freezing water at night, stored safely beneath the dome. The old and the new shake hands quietly in the desert dusk. Mainstream architects today point to Persian designs as models for sustainable construction. Thick insulation, passive ventilation, and underground chambers are ideas reborn in eco-homes and urban cooling projects. You imagine university students sketching Yakchal diagrams alongside solar towers, professors nodding as if to say, "See, the future sometimes lives in the past." In design journals, the phrase vernacular architecture appears again and again, and the Yakchal is its star pupil. Here's your quirky tidbit. In recent years, competitions in Iran have challenged architects to design modern ice houses inspired by Yakshals, with prizes for those who combine ancient efficiency with contemporary aesthetics. One proposal even suggested turning them into ice libraries, where blocks of frozen water could be shared in times of shortage. Historians still argue whether these projects are practical solutions or symbolic gestures, but either way they prove the dome isn't done speaking. You walk deeper into this imagined future town. Inside a school, children gather around models of Yakchals, learning how their ancestors kept cool before wires hummed. A teacher pours water into a clay jar, sets it beneath a small wind catcher, and watches the students' eyes widen as they feel the air shift cooler. Lessons aren't just about science, they're about memory, resilience, and the poetry of making do with what you have. Beyond the village, you see cities adopting similar principles. Skyscrapers with shaded courtyards, office towers that channel wind through vertical shafts, apartment blocks that use earth insulation to reduce heat. Modern engineers borrow ancient tricks like students copying notes from the wise elder at the back of the class. Somewhere, you can almost hear a Persian ancestor chuckle. "Took you long enough." That's your first soft joke, drifting in with the breeze. In another vision, climate change reshapes deserts into harsher places. Communities search desperately for low-energy cooling. The Yakshal returns, not as heritage, but as necessity. Imagine aid groups building new domes beside refugee camps, storing ice created at night to give relief by day. The idea feels both ancient and radical, a pre-electric technology carrying hope into the 21st century. Historians still argue about whether humanity should lean backward for solutions or forge ahead with new inventions. But walking here, you realize it's not a contest. The future may need both, humming machines and silent domes, complex systems and humble clay. The Yakchal doesn't demand worship, it simply offers itself again, as it always has. The desert evening cools in your mind, and you settle one last time against the dome. Its surface is rough but steady, like the hand of an elder guiding you. You imagine the centuries whispering around you, voices of builders, snow carriers, sherbet vendors, poets, and children catching droplets in their palms. Their laughter, their sighs, their hopes still echo faintly in the plaster. You realize you've walked a long path tonight, from mountain snow to royal courts, from bazaars to medical huts, from poets' verses to modern eco-homes. Every step has been about one simple truth, that humans, when faced with impossible heat, find ways to hold on to coolness. Sometimes it's survival, sometimes it's luxury, often it's both at once. And so the Yakchal stands, timeless, an inverted beehive of patience. It has seen dynasties rise and fade, caravans come and go, and freezers click to life. Yet it still whispers the same promise. Winter can be saved for summer. Comfort can be shared, and ingenuity is often nothing more than clay, straw, and trust in the breeze. You let your eyes close, leaning against the dome, and the last thing you feel is the desert softening, not defeated, but balanced. And that's where the story pauses, quiet and steady, like ice resting beneath layers of straw. Word count, wind down, 300 words. The desert night stretches long now, and your breath begins to slow with it. You picture the dome standing alone under the stars, its surface pale in moonlight, its interior holding silence as carefully as it once held ice. The air grows softer, the edges of sound blur, and even the wind seems to settle into a slower rhythm. You imagine lying at the base of the Yakkul, the clay warm beneath your back, the sky opening wide above. The stars scatter endlessly, each one cool and steady like tiny lanterns strung by invisible hands. Around you, the desert is no longer harsh. It has become a quiet ocean of sand, a place where time drifts without hurry. Each detail of the night feels elongated. The breeze brushes your cheek, the faint smell of straw lingers, and you hear water droplets falling somewhere far away, unhurried, eternal. Those drops remind you that even in the hottest places, coolness is always waiting. Sometimes hidden, sometimes fleeting, but always possible. Your body softens as you listen. Muscles release, thoughts slow, the urgency of the day loosens its grip. What remains is calmness. The same calmness that kept villagers steady as they packed ice beneath straw, knowing they had prepared for what was coming. You too are prepared, for rest, for stillness, for letting go. So let your breath follow the dome's shape, wide at the base, narrowing slowly, gently toward the sky. Inhale deeply, exhale longer, and feel yourself settling into the rhythm of something older than worry, older than time. And as your eyes close fully now, remember, the dome still stands, silent in the night, keeping watch. You are safe, you are cool, you are at rest.